All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Civil War Institute author series. My name is Cameron Sauers. I'm a fellow at the Civil War Institute. I'm very excited to be joined today by Dr. David Silkenat, who is a senior lecturer in American history at the University of Edinburgh. He received his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he has authored 3 books. The first was, if I remember correctly, and I have them in order, Moments of Despair, Suicide, Divorce, and Debt in Civil War Era North Carolina. And he also wrote Driven from Home, North Carolina's Civil War Refugee Crisis. But today we're going to be talking about his latest book, Raising the White Flag, How Surrender Defined the American Civil War, which was released through our friends at the University of North Carolina Press. I'll put in the description for the video a link to the book's page, so you can get a copy of it through the press. Now, Professor, to start off, there is something you wrote in the acknowledgements that was the inspiration for my first question. It's how you come to the topic of writing about surrender. And you said that this came to you in a dream. So,
yes, it did.
So I'm curious, after the dream, what was kind of your first steps in starting to think, okay, how can I actually write a book about surrender? What sources did really start to click for you to make you think, yes, this is a possible book?
Right. Well, so yeah, most historians come to their ideas, in the archives where they come across a document or they read something. And this idea of the kernel for the book actually did come to me in a dream. And luckily I had a Post-it notepad right next to my bed, and I woke up in the middle of the night and I wrote down surrender in Civil War, and I just sort of stuck it there. And a couple of years later, the book came out. The kernel of the book, the sort of the genesis of it, the dream that I had, is simply that they surrendered a lot, right? Like that's the central problem the book is trying to explain. Is this is a war that begins with a surrender at Fort Sumter. At least that's the way we usually think of it beginning, and it ends with these series of surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse and Bennett Place and the Shenandoah and what have you. And in between, many of the major turning points in the war, Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, are surrenders. And the more I started to think about, the more I realized they're surrendering a lot. Like this is a very frequent phenomenon. There are dozens and dozens, literally, of surrenders in the book. Some are, the ones I've mentioned already, are ones that are well known. A bunch of others that are much less well known. And I wanted to sort of make sense of what it is about the Civil War that caused people to surrender so much, and to make sense of the sort of mentality that went into surrender. Because I realized very early on that they understood surrender in a very different way than, say, Americans do today. In the United States that I grew up in, that you grew up in, surrender was something that was seen as being fundamentally un-American. Americans never surrender. At least that's what we tell ourselves. In fact, there's lots of politicians you can find saying some versions of Americans never surrender. Kennedy said it during the Cuban Missile Crisis in that famous television address. Nixon said it, Reagan said it, Clinton said it, Obama said it, both of the Bushes said it, Trump has said it, McCain has said it. Like everybody who's an American politician in the second half of the 20th century in 21st century has said some version of that. And of course, these are people who don't agree on much of anything else, but they seem to all agree that Americans never surrender. But on the other hand, here, a century and a half ago, Americans are surrendering all the time. And so I realized they clearly thought of it in very different ways, that one could surrender and do so and not have it be shameful, not have it be dishonorable. That many of the people who surrendered emerged from the surrender, with their status elevated. Robert Anderson, after he surrendered at Fort Sumter, emerged as a national hero. Robert E. Lee, when he surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, the soldiers, if anything, loved him more afterwards. And so I was trying to sort of make sense of, what were the rules, what were the sort of frameworks in which Civil War Americans understood surrender? What did it mean to them? When could you surrender? When couldn't you surrender? And how did it play out, over the course of 4 years of conflict?
One of the things that to me, and you wrote, I think this is in the introduction of the book, is how this book blends military history and very much cultural history. There's a lot in this book that I'm going to touch on later about where gender and race starts to play into ideas of this. So I'm just curious kind of what a cultural study of the military rather than just a strict military history could offer us.
Well, this book was an education for me in a ways, because if you mentioned my two earlier books, which are both Civil War books of a kind, but they're not military history in the slightest. This one is, I mean, it focuses on battles and the outcomes of battles, but at the part of the battle that interests me when they choose not to fight rather than when they're choosing to fight. And what I was really interested in doing is sort of making sense of, what are the choices that their officers are making? What are the frameworks they're using for making those decisions? And the choices that soldiers are making. About half the people who surrender in the Civil War are surrendered by their officer. So you're thinking about these large surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse in Vicksburg and what have you. The other half are people who are surrendering on the battlefield. And so I really had to sort of get into the mentality of individual soldiers. Because one of the few choices they could make on the battlefield was the choice to surrender. These are guys, after all, who are told, when to march and how fast to march and who to shoot at and when to load their gun. They're told how to do everything on the battlefield. They really have very little, relatively speaking, autonomy. But the choice to surrender is one of the things that soldiers could choose to do as an individual. And it's actually a choice that two individuals have to make. It's somebody who has to surrender. They have to throw down their gun, raise their hands and yell that they surrender. And somebody else has to accept that surrender. And so I had to sort of try to make sense of that mentality. And I think it helps, when you look at battles through the lens of surrender, they look very, very different than if you look at them, rather if you're trying to do them through a purely military lens. There's a chapter in the book, for instance, that looks at the Battle of Gettysburg, which, I think is a battle everybody knows very well. And obviously, you know it probably better than I do, because you're in and around it every day. But, one of the things I tried to do in that chapter was say, okay, well, let's look at this battle through the lens of the men who surrendered in Gettysburg. And there are people who surrender, from the moment that battle starts until, all the way through, Pickett's charge and then afterwards. And there are more men who surrender at Gettysburg, both Union and Confederate soldiers, than there are people who are killed there. Right. And so we tend to think about, when we walk the battlefields, we tend to think, here's where, these men died, and here's where these men were wounded, and here's where this movement happened. But you walk around the battlefield from the lens of the people who, are choosing not to fight in the middle of conflict. I think that makes it look very, very different.
One of the things that to me I started to think about is, I go for my afternoon walk around the battlefield, is that the numbers on the monuments that might say captured, to instead think of that as what if that said surrender, and how we talk about ideas of the agency to make the active decision to surrender. And then on the flip side, when a unit boasts about, oh, we took 100 prisoners, that's a twofold exchange. Right. Which is an interesting concept for me.
Yeah. So we often think of captured. They use the same, when we talk about sort of monuments and military historians, they use the same language for capturing a hill and capturing a cannon and capturing a person. And I would argue that capturing a person is a fundamentally different phenomenon, because people have agency, people have make choices, and thinking about signs and the ways in which they list casualties, which is a term that I think historians understand what that means, but I think oftentimes people who visit parks think that casualty means killed, when in fact it means killed, wound, captured, or missing. And so includes all these people who are surrendering. So it makes it look very, very different when you think about these are men who in fact are not killed. The thing about people who surrender is they live and they get to fight another day many of the time. So
yeah. One of the stories of a group that lives to fight another day was the 126th New York, these Harper's Ferry cowards, because I worked at Harper's Ferry for a summer, and we would always tell their story. And as you mentioned in the book, they surrender at Harper's Ferry, which is one of the largest surrenders of American soldiers in the Civil War.
It's the largest Union surrender.
There we go. Yeah, the largest Union surrender. And then, and correct me if I'm wrong, the 126th New York then fights at Gettysburg and tries to find some redemption, which to me shows exactly your point that these units do live to fight another day, and they do have to kind of restore some ideas of honor and courage after surrendering.
Well, they're an interesting case, and Harper's Ferry is an interesting case because that's one of the few surrenders in the war that is seen as being dishonorable. Right. Then most surrenders, both sides agree that the surrender was actually the right choice for the officer to make. What happened at Harper's Ferry is the Union commander in charge, Dixon Miles, surrendered what was often seen as surrendering prematurely. And the people who were labeled as the Harper's Ferry cowards, many of them hadn't got a chance to fire their weapon. Many of them, in fact, hadn't even unpacked their weapons. Many of them were new recruits. And so they really had to redeem themselves, and they felt that the shame of the surrender sort of got transferred to them. Obviously, though, they were not involved in the decision. But people who get involved in other surrenders, they don't really feel any kind of shame attached to it, like the way that the soldiers at Harper's Ferry did.
Just to contrast, talking about a large scale surrender like the one at Harper's Ferry, where we see forts or garrisons surrendered, as opposed to the instances where individuals or smaller groups are surrendering. Can you kind of explain what the big difference is and how those might have been received differently?
Well, when we think about people who are surrendering on the battlefield, one of the ways in which helps to understand is the people who are surrendering on the battlefield tend to often actually be the bravest soldiers, because you have to be physically very close to the enemy to be able to surrender, right? You have to be close enough where they can see you, where they can hear you. In Civil War battlefields, as you know, were amazingly loud, chaotic places. There's lots of smoke. You can't see 20 feet in front of you often. So, the people who are surrendering are usually the last people to retreat when everyone else has run away, or the one who's advanced faster than everybody else in his regiment has, or somehow been separated from them. So the people who are surrendering on the battlefield are tend to be, very brave soldiers, and they are perceived that way both by the people who capture them and usually by the men in their regiment, that they are seen as being somebody who was willing to get that close enough to the enemy where they had to surrender. And it's the thing about choosing to surrender on a battlefield, it's as opposed to these large formal ones, these are decisions that soldiers have to make instantaneously, right? They don't have a huge amount of time to think about, should I surrender now? Should I not surrender now? Am I going to negotiate? Somebody's pointing a gun at you, your weapon has been discharged. Lots of soldiers are choosing to drop their weapons and raise their arms. And you see that a lot, thinking about Gettysburg. You see that a lot in the railroad cut on the first day, where there are actually a couple of different groups of people who surrender because that's a place where they find themselves trapped, and they realize that if the choice is between being shot or getting taken prisoner, they choose to be taken prisoner. You see that, at Little Round Top. The thing people forget about that sort of charge that Chamberlain and the 20th Maine make is that most of the Confederate soldiers, they don't get killed. Most of them drop their weapons and surrender. Pickett's charge. Obviously, lots of people died in Pickett's charge, but also lots of Confederates surrendered, and a handful of Union soldiers surrendered. And you say to yourself, well, that doesn't make it. Why are Union soldiers surrendering? Well, they're finding themselves on that opposite side of a very small stone wall. They may have fired their weapon. They may have two Confederates on the other side of the wall that have not fired their weapons. In order to reload their weapon, they'd have to stand up. So they yell through the wall, they surrender, and then they walk back down the hill. And dozens of Union soldiers did. And when we sort of read the battle that way, it looks very different.
Yeah, and I'll say
It's not the way it's depicted in the cyclorama.
Yeah, and I'll say for someone like me, who being here, living in Gettysburg for the last few years and spending a lot of time on battlefield and on tours, the chapter on surrender at Gettysburg really did make me think about the flow of the battle in a different way. That there is kind of a stream of men on both sides who are being marched to the enemy's rear, who are surrendering, and I think that's an interesting thing to consider. Because I know I'm content to run down Confederate Avenue or down the Union fishhook and not realize that there's going to be some Confederate men behind the Union lines and vice versa who have surrendered. And that's an interesting thing to think about.
Oh, there were, yeah, they were huge, camps basically of prisoners on both sides. And you can read the letters that the soldiers write back after the battle where they're describing what their experiences were like there. And these were actually places where Confederates got information about what Union soldiers were there, because they could look and say, oh, look, we've captured people from these regiments. Now we know who we're fighting against. And the same was true for the Union side, where they could, learn something about the composition of the enemy based on the people they captured. So.
And one of the interesting things that you pay attention to in the book is where surrender, how surrender, if it's even allowed, differs for USCTs who are fighting, that the introduction of that really changes the dynamic of fighting and really, I think, starts to change experiences of surrenders.
Oh yeah. Like everything else in the Civil War, race really fundamentally shapes the way in which surrender works. And I think, as most people watching this know, that the Confederacy responded with great anger and rage at the introduction of black soldiers into the Union Army. And the official Confederate policy was that captured USCT soldiers would not be prisoners of war and treated the way that other prisoners of war would, but they would be returned to slavery. In practice, the Confederate policy was often to execute captured USCT soldiers. And we have lots of examples of Black Union soldiers trying to surrender and being killed. The most famous example is at Fort Pillow, but there are dozens of other examples. And so Black soldiers from especially in 1864 and 1865, knew they couldn't surrender, knew that the kinds of rules that applied for white soldiers didn't apply to them. And so that caused them to fight in a very different way, right? A white soldier who was surrounded realizes that surrender is a better option. An African-American realizes that it isn't a better option. And they often said, okay, look, if we are not allowed to surrender, we're not going to allow Confederates to surrender, right? They say, remember Fort Pillow. And so you have a very different kind of fighting happening as a consequence, right? When you have, let's say, the Battle of the Crater, which happens not that long after Fort Pillow, the USCT soldiers say they're not going to surrender. And they also say, we're not going to take any prisoners. And you have some of the bloodiest fighting in the war then. The other way in which the introduction of Black soldiers that really changed surrender is that it really led to the collapse of prisoner exchange, which is really a fundamental part of how surrender worked. For most of the first half of the war, and especially the sort of middle third of the war, there was a really robust prisoner exchange program that was formalized in something called the Dix Hill Cartel in 1862. In which people who were captured, people who surrendered, were paroled, that is to say, they were released within 10 days after their surrender. And then they would then be exchanged for an equal number of soldiers on the opposite side and then be allowed to return to their regiment. Which meant that if you surrendered, you could be back and fighting with your regiment within 2 weeks, really. And I found several examples of people who surrendered 2 or 3 times in the course of 6 months. And their time in captivity was relatively limited. Their time in captivity was relatively benign. They were usually moderately well fed and taken care of. And that whole system falls apart when Confederates refused to accept African-American soldiers as legitimate soldiers. And the union says, well, if you're not going to treat all of our soldiers like soldiers, you're clearly breaking our terms of our deal. The deal's off. And that had huge consequences, because that's really what led to places like Andersonville. When prisoner exchange falls apart, then you end up with people who are captured, ending up in these prisons where they are not going to be returning home, where they're not going to be well fed, where they're going to probably, in many cases, die of disease or starvation. And so that changed the whole dynamic of, thinking about, especially in 1864, when you really have the worst of this. Surrender looks like a much less appealing option than it did 2 years earlier, right? And so the rubric and the thinking about, okay, what's going to happen after I surrender changes when prisoner exchange falls apart.
One last question I have, I think a really now timely and relevant, interesting section of the book for me that I really stewed over was the final surrenders of the Civil War at Appomattox and at Bennett Place, and how understanding those events and how different ideas about the surrenders that end the war impact our current understanding of Civil War memory and the lost cause. So I was wondering if you could just kind of talk through some of that a little bit and what that means for us.
Well, I think one thing that's important to understand, obviously, is the Confederacy didn't surrender like Japan did at the end of the Second World War, where there is a capitulation by the Confederate government. And this happened for lots of complex reasons, partially because Lincoln didn't want them to, because Lincoln didn't want to, in some ways, recognize the Confederacy in its death. Lincoln, of course, always called it the so-called Confederacy. He said the Confederacy was never legitimate, secession was never constitutional, and so you don't want to accept a surrender of the Confederacy, because that then legitimizes the previous 4 years. Jefferson Davis, ironically, agreed with him on this. He said, I couldn't surrender the Confederacy. I have lots of power as Confederate president, but killing the country isn't one of them. And so you do end up with these sort of fragmentary surrenders of Confederate armies, and they're at Appomattox Courthouse and Bennett Place in Citronelle, in, dozens of other smaller locations where smaller groups of Confederates lay down their arms. And I think that had some, really major consequences for the way Reconstruction looked. And as you pointed out, has major consequences for things like the lost cause. Former Confederates could often say, look, we were defeated on the battlefield because of overwhelming numbers, but we didn't surrender the things we fought for. The causes of supremacy, the causes that we devoted ourselves to for 4 years, we never surrendered our principles. And the rubric and the language of the lost cause emerges so quickly after the war, and it's in part because they have, framework then for understanding what they lost, but also what they claim they didn't lose. And if you visit these surrender sites, they're intriguing places to visit. I'm imagining you've been to maybe Appomattox Courthouse. If you go to them, they look very different than, say, battlefields do. Battlefields, if you go to them, they are littered with monuments. You probably, when you go jogging, you can't go 20 feet without tripping over a monument to something or other. Surrender sites are often, they have very few monuments. If you go to Appomattox Courthouse, there's basically one monument there, and it's in the middle of the woods, and you really got to want to go see it to go see it. If you go to Bennett Place, there's a monument, but it's a very weird looking monument. And some of these other surrender sites at the end of the war, there's no monuments at all, which I think speaks to, how Americans struggle to figure out, well, how do we think about these places? How do we think about what surrender means at the end of the war, and what's the right way to talk about what happened there, and how the end of the war created the framework for what happened during Reconstruction and what's happened in the 150 years since. So they're very interesting locations for thinking about memory.
So, Professor Silkenat, thank you so much for joining me today. For our Facebook audience and for those watching on YouTube, be sure to pick up a copy of Raising the White Flag, How Surrender Defined the Civil War. It's available now from UNC Press. We'll put a link in the description so you're able to check it out. Be sure to stay tuned to our social media channels as we continue to produce a range of digital content to help bring the Civil War to your house as we're all still kind of on lockdown. So thank you so much for joining us and tuning in. Professor Silkenat, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.